Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. We have another special show for you today. Very exciting. We are going to be talking about comprehension, and we're going to be discussing two articles. One is by Natalie Wexler, and it is called New Study Suggests Standardized Reading Tests Miss a Lot of Learning, and that is in Forbes. And the other article is by Nate the Great Joseph, and it is called What's Better for Reading Comprehension, Strategy or Content Knowledge Instruction? And that is a meta-analysis. So we invited Dr. Leslie Laud on because she is the leader, the founder of SRSD, Think SRSD, Self-Regulated Strategy Development for Reading and Writing. She is a writer, a researcher, and is a leader in the area of the science of writing instruction. And we are so pleased to have her on because she does a lot of work in this area, both in reading and writing, and she does professional development. And I thought it was important to get a different view because, when we follow social media, we seem to get a very narrow view from people who certainly have a lot to say and important things to say. But I wanted to widen the discussion a bit. And I thought that, your views and your knowledge would be a wonderful addition for tonight's episode. So I'm going to start actually with something right from Natalie Wexler's article. And it is on the last page of her article where she said, does it make sense to measure progress using tests that focus on supposed comprehension skills, knowing they may fail to capture actual learning? Even more crucially, should we continue to attach high stakes to tests that mislead educators into thinking knowledge is irrelevant to comprehension? And so I'm focusing on those two questions, Leslie, because after reading the article, I'm going to sum it up for our viewers, that basically Natalie is saying that, background knowledge is very important. She has said this numerous times, but this time she was really focused on the standardized tests that do not reflect gains from content knowledge instruction. And, she has some very good points in here that I do want to bring up, but I'd like to start with your view on some of those questions that she brought up in the article. What are some of your thoughts about that?
Well, for that section, a couple of thoughts come to mind. I think it's a good point. She's raising a really important point about the fact that these tests are not measuring knowledge. And it is a really interesting theoretical question, but it's theory. It's not the real world that we live in today. Could this issue in a policy change that could come to our schools in the future? It's possible. It would probably take many years for the tests to change. And maybe she's starting something that could take hold in the schools down the road. But right now, the way that the tests are working, it's true that they're not measuring knowledge. And I think we have to be careful about the real world, feet on the ground schools versus interesting theories, because the worry is that people will then look at this theory try to implement it in their schools, expect to see gains in ELA, not achieve those gains, because I'll get into it a little bit more later about how raising knowledge has not translated over to the distal gains that these tests measure. So for a lot of schools, these tests are high stakes. Principals are evaluated on them. Children need to pass them. Schools are evaluated. Schools are closed. There are very high stakes repercussions attached. And to go and say, well, the test should change and then we should be teaching differently, building knowledge, is a little precarious. Now, I do want to come back later, and I'm sure we will, to the importance of building knowledge, but let's not put a myth out there that by building knowledge, we'll see gains on the ELA tests, because we haven't.
Okay. So now, Judy, we've had both Natalie Wexler on, and we've had Nate Joseph on. And the other article is Nate's article, and he did a meta-analysis, and he pretty much is saying what Leslie just said, Dr. Leslie Laud just said, that from what he could see, that the only benefits that there are with this content knowledge curriculum is when it's specific to the text being used. That if you are going to give background knowledge, it's specific to what is being read that will help improve and show in the studies. He said it does not improve general reading comprehension to have a content knowledge curriculum. What are your thoughts about what Nate's article said?
So I have a lot of thoughts in general. So one thing that you said initially, I know we're going to talk about Nate, but you said, Natalie Wexler says, does it make sense? That sounded a little bit like FNP. Does it make sense? But anyway, so thoughts on Nate. So I think it's actually really interesting, because I think there's so many things that are crucial to think about. When we say knowledge building, there are so many topics out there that we can talk about with students. I think it's really important to think about, how do we determine what is really important? Do we talk about panda bears? Do we talk about dinosaurs? Are we talking about all the continents? How do we determine what knowledge is really going to help kids? Because a lot of those tests that kids take, a lot of that content is very unfamiliar to kids. Another problem is that a lot of kids that are taking that test sit there for 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, and they can't even read it.
Well,
So,
that's a different story altogether.
but it's a big part of the story.
Of course.
So in general, my thoughts are, Nate said a lot of things. I think he said that teaching skills had a value. Is that correct, Faith?
So you're talking about comprehension skills.
Yeah.
Yes. And so, yes, that was in the meta-analysis, that
And
there is
right.
a benefit to teaching some comprehension skills. And as Leslie's going to tell us, teaching comprehension skills well is the key. Perhaps hasn't been done well up until this point.
And that's the biggest point that, really resonated with me, because I feel like on social media, all these articles we're reading, there's so many mixed messages. Teachers, now we know phonics is a priority. We know decoding skills has been neglected, and Emily Hanford brought that to light, right? Now we're being told, one person says this, do this, do this. We were teaching some skill teaching before,
that's
right?
exactly what we want to discuss tonight. We're getting information from different sources. And I think the average teacher is left trying to figure this out. Administrators are going to start buying new programs.
That's right.
We want to make sure they're making good decisions. So, Leslie, could you speak now about what some of your research is and what your view is on comprehension in terms of building it?
I think the three of us are very connected to schools. We're
Yes.
in schools all the time. We are,
Yes.
eating lunch with teachers every day. We are teaching classes, modeling lessons, and we're really, really in the trenches.
Yes.
For us and for the people we're working with, these dichotomies and these splits don't resonate and don't make sense. We know that kids need both. We
Mhm.
know that we need to be building knowledge. Of course, it's so fun. We need to do that, and we need to empower kids with agency and strategies, and empower the teachers too. When the teachers learn really effective strategies and use them with kids, they're so excited. They see the kids be able to use these strategies. So I just want to back up and say, the knowledge, the research base behind teaching knowledge is weak. There is a link that we can share with you at the end to a spreadsheet that lists out the various research studies. The biggest was done by Gerard, 2017, thousands of children, hundreds of teachers in the UK, and it actually, it foregrounded teaching knowledge. The outcomes, it was long-term, I think a year or two, the outcomes were negative.
Mhm.
There was actually a loss. The other studies that have tried, like Connor, they've gotten no outcomes. The highest that I've seen from Sonia Cabell was 0.09 for vocabulary.
Wow.
And to her credit, she's told me again and again, you have to be really careful with effect sizes, but still it's a 0.09. And the others are negative. So foregrounding the teaching of knowledge can be harmful and can result in very small effect sizes. Now flip over and look at the work of Nell Duke and Pearson and all of the reading strategies people, Vaughn and Wanzek.
Mhm.
Wanzek's 2017 study had an effect size of 0.38, which is 4 times that of teaching knowledge. So when you look at the strategy research, you really can move the dial on something. Now, to Natalie Wexler's good point, we don't know quite what that is. It's not knowledge, but it is an ability to attack a text more strategically and to therefore extract more meaning from it. Kids can do that, and they can get better at it. And the research shows that when they are taught how to do that, they will read better any text. But when we push the knowledge, we're not seeing any gains. Now, we should do both.
Right, right. So I'm going to go back to the article, Natalie's article. And Natalie had written, and with this, I think she makes a very good point, where she said that knowledge building, the approach, it's not easy to get evidence for it because the process takes so long. Right. And so you're not going to see it in the first 2 years, where most times when there's a study done, that's what they're looking at, that this is cumulative and you start to see this over time. So Judy, you and I tutor kids, we work with kids, we're in the schools, we coach. So, I could tell you that this makes a lot of sense to me, because when I do work with kids, sometimes it doesn't translate to a standardized test. When kids are so far behind, I could be making progress with a child, but it's not going to show up in a standardized test because they're so far behind that it just, we still have so much work to do. So that logic of it not showing up right away makes sense to me. Your thoughts, Judy, on that point?
So I totally agree with you as well, but I think like for the average school teacher or for the average coach, it's currently extremely, extremely overwhelming to have to deal with all these pillars and make sure that they're all being taught correctly. Everybody's stressed out. Many people are focusing so much on phonics and so forth, but phonics is only a piece of the pie. We know that, right? We know comprehension is a critical piece, but unfortunately, it's really tough. For a long time now, we're making sure that reading is getting done, but we're cutting things like science and we're cutting things like social studies or, they only have science once a week, or maybe not at all.
Well, that's
So-
actually what Natalie was saying in the
Right.
article,
So
that
that's
we don't
important
really
too.
have a large chunk of time in social studies and science because we spend a lot of time in reading instruction, that she's thinking that maybe some of that should be spent building that knowledge. But what my question to you was the
Yeah.
idea of not really seeing gains on a standardized test, because what you're doing, it might not reflect what you're doing. That's what I was asking. Do you ever do that when you work with kids and you
Right.
know they're making gains, but it's not going to show up at that moment in time because they're not there yet?
Well, of course. Well, one of the problems is a lot of kids can't read. We have a literacy crisis in this country. So that's the biggest problem right now. Kids see the passage and probably like, I can't name a number because I'm not a math person. I'm not a math person. However, there's so many kids that are sitting there and can't do it. And then the other part is that, you know, a lot of teachers are working on test prep right now, right? They're showing kids how to annotate. They're showing kids how to underline. Is that important? Is that not important? Are we doing it right? Are we not doing it right? Then there was F&P. We were doing, you know, F&P is kind of like going this way right now. But, you know, there were some strategy building there, text to self connections, text to world connections. Let's do an inference. Let's make a connection. Bottom line is, what's the right approach? What's
Okay,
the right
so
approach?
Leslie, jump in right now because I saw you writing something down. So I know that you're thinking about what I said. So what is your thought about when Natalie says that perhaps this is incremental academic progress and it might not show up where you're not going to see those gains the way you would expect? What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with her fully. I
Yeah.
think she's a gem to our field because she's bringing something to light that I wish had
Right.
been known 20 years ago, 30 when I began. She's absolutely spot on that the knowledge is so incredibly important. We were doing all of this writing from head. Writing is the area I think about, but, you know, reading Goosebumps, you know, I mean, they're wonderful books for recess time and for home, but we need to be building knowledge without a doubt. And thank goodness that our field has her and that she has brought this to light. But like anyone, we all have our it's a big elephant and we're all touching it from different places. And I so appreciate what she has illuminated. And there are further pieces. She's right. Background knowledge will grow slowly. It's important. We need to be doing it. The strategies are fast. So it's an and both. And when we teach the strategies, and I want to bring it in a self-regulated way, when we're actively teaching children how to self-regulate how they use the strategies, and we're not picking from a hat and using them badly and using poor, weak, like here's how you underline. That's not a strategy. A strategy might be learning how to use who, did, what, when, where to find the gist. The latest version of the IES practice guides is on reading interventions, grade 4 through 9.
4 to 9. I love that.
I think
Maybe we
one
should put that into
That
the
would be a
show
great
notes.
input, but one
Yeah.
of the first strategies there is how to find the gist, and it's got the strongest level of evidence.
Yes.
And I'm hearing it left and right from all my teachers. When they teach the kids how to find the gist, they're reading in a different way, and they do it 10 words on my fingers. And it's a quick thing. So I think the strategies are really fast. We will see a bump. We can do it. It's so empowering because we do see the gains right away. The Cumberland Public Schools in Rhode Island went from 40 to 80% proficient.
Wow.
It went up 30%. Yeah. New York City, Benson School went from 30% proficient to 77. After using these strategies. That's why New York City is trying to roll out self-regulated strategy development all over the city, because they saw these gains in the pilot schools. So strategies are fast. Background knowledge is slow.
So I have a book on just about everything. And so, as I was talking to Leslie before, so I'm a big believer in all of these types of strategies. Strategies done well. I do this with my students. I do summarizing strategies. I think it's important that we don't just throw this important part of learning out the window and think that just alone putting in content is going to do it. I do think strategies taught well are so important. I want to just jump in a second. What are your thoughts about children's literature? We keep talking about nonfiction.
Yeah, right.
And I could tell you, years ago when I worked in the city, I was trained as a great books leader, which is all about shared inquiry and asking questions and teaching kids to question the text and have conversations around real good children's books. And we're not having a conversation about literature anymore. What are your thoughts? And then I would love to hear from Judy also, what's happening in the city schools. Did we get rid of literature? What are your thoughts?
Like you, just like you, I've wondered, where has that gone in the conversation? It's so important. I have read research studies that children who read literature tend to set higher goals when they're reading literature with people that they admire. But yeah, it's a beautiful, uplifting experience for children. It's what hooks them in and makes them readers. And when they become readers, they develop that Velcro, where it's like a snowball effect, and they're picking up language and vocabulary because they're hooked into a book. You don't get as hooked into informational text the way you do literature. So I'm worried about it.
You know, it depends.
Maybe some do. Some you're absolutely right.
And as they get older, I think for sure they do.
But yeah.
Judy, what are your thoughts about children's literature? Are you seeing that put to the side in favor of more nonfiction and not really seeing literature anymore?
So as you all know, I work for the city schools, but all views are my own. So generally what I'm seeing, even outside of work, when I'm working with kids and so forth, I'm definitely seeing that a lot of attention is on nonfiction pieces. Also, so we just started the universal screeners, and those topics, kids are supposed to retell and so forth. The topics were written, it seems like a really long time ago. I think the screeners are very effective at seeing if a kid can read very quickly with the oral reading fluency. However, a lot of those passages are really unfamiliar to kids. And I'm just curious, if it was like an article about Roblox or Minecraft, would that shift the needle, and would more kids be able to push through? Because quite frankly, when kids are reading right now, they're having a really hard time, because I think a lot of schools are transitioning. They're really pushing kids to read more decodable texts and so forth. And it's always a numbers game in schools. Do we have time for this?
Decodable books while they're learning to read.
But the problem is time. Do we still have time for the other things? So many kids are struggling. So it's like, you have to think about, do we have this? Do we have that? Do we have the read aloud? Do we have shared reading? Do we do small group? I think it's everybody's heart right now, I think, is in the right place. But I've been saying this episode after episode, I think it has to come more solution-based right now, because I think we know that there's a problem. We know storytelling is great, right? We all love to do those great read alouds. I don't know if schools are prioritizing that right now, because I think the big push is to get kids to decode better right now, because it's a crisis. Kids cannot decode well. A lot of kids, not all kids.
Now that's very interesting. So, I'm going to stop you right there, because obviously we know that reading rope is supposed to be covering two domains, right? Word recognition and language comprehension.
Yeah.
Leslie, what do you say to what Judy is noticing? Do you agree that perhaps we're not spending enough time on read alouds or language building, and we're more focused now on just getting kids to decode? Is that what you're seeing? I mean, I'm wondering, when you go into schools.
Oh, yeah. I think that language, listening comprehension. So we have the simple view of reading for people watching. I'm sure you're all familiar, but the simple view of reading is word recognition and listening comprehension, or basically decoding, crack the code, and then higher order thinking and language, those two sides. And crack the code is in the spotlight right now. Like, people are aware that we need phonics, and that has grown. And science of reading is being connected with phonics.
Mhm.
But all of us who've been carrying this torch for 30 years, like I have, I was Orton Gillingham back in the 90s. We're all saying, wait, stop the train. This is also the higher order, but the higher order is a slipperier pig. You see growth in it much more slowly than you do with phonics. You learn how to teach phonics and you're like, whoa, I got that kid reading. She can crack the code now. But with the listening comp, it's much slower, but we can do it. We have a causal evidence bank, but unfortunately we are slipping into theory and correlational. All through Natalie Wexler's piece, she's citing correlational studies. Now, she did cite one that was empirical, which is a step forward, which is good. But I think a lot of people are looking at correlational theoretical on studies on what contributes to listening comprehension. And we really need to be looking at the empirical. And when we look at the cause effect, this is a really important question for people to ask. Was the study correlational? Did it just show which things match up, or did somebody go in and do something in a school and measure the outcome? That is the research that we need. And when we look at that for listening comprehension, there are really powerful things we can do in a read aloud to structure and scaffold that building of that slipperier pig. And we can measure it. We can measure it through writing. When we collect a writing sample from kids, we can see where their language and listening comp is at
100%, 100%. I do the same thing as I'm working with kids. I really look at the writing samples as well. So I'm going to go to what Nate said. In his meta-analysis, he suggested that there is no transfer effect to background knowledge instruction. Or at least very little. I maybe no transfer effect is a little bit too strong, but very little transfer effect. And Natalie Wexler brought this up in her article about near transfer, far transfer. And, I think people looking at that article might be confused by what all of that actually means between near, far transfer. The issue is we as teachers just want to know
what to do.
What to do.
Right.
I think that's the bottom line. We just want to know what to do. So what is your formula based on all
I can
of
share that.
Yes, I'd like to hear it.
I mean,
would too.
Again, we're all touching the elephant from different places. Natalie Wexler is very theoretical. She has given us a gift in illuminating this, the importance of background knowledge. The research doesn't bear out that building that will move ELA scores, as you're saying. Maybe it takes years and years. We don't know yet, but we don't have a research base yet to support that bringing on knowledge. But what can we do? We do know a lot. There's something called the science of reading, and it, as we all know, and it's not only phonics. There is a lot of research on what works in the comprehension field. And I'm surprised that that is not being illuminated more so as well. So what can we do in the science of reading? I think the first thing we all need to do is we must be educated consumers, like an FDA. Like, we need to ask, does this pill actually work? Did it work for your aunt or somebody you know out in Colorado? Or has it been through the FDA, and does it really work? Because we have that with what works, and we have that with our research world. In quick summary, what does the research say works? Gist statements are really powerful. Teaching kids to use organizers to understand what they've read and before they write, both. Those are reciprocal processes. They are the same area of the brain. Using organizers that look at text structure. We know that starting from the structure of the text is the best way entry to understanding what that text says. Then you go in at the sentence level, then you can start pulling out the vocab and what that means. But the research, if you look at any studies, starting by pulling apart text structure, now very quickly, you have to do syntax, you have to do vocab, they all have to work together. But text structure is our golden baby. So just statements, text structure, then how to parse syntax. We don't have any isolated studies on pulling apart sentences, but Sharon Vaughn, who studies this really well, integrates it in with what she's doing. Vocab, I do believe teaching vocab, we have some good stuff. But we have stuff. This is not an I don't know. Natalie Wexler is putting a theory out there. It's very interesting. We need to think about it. We need to cover all our bases and teach knowledge, but there is no evidence to suggest that that will raise ELA outcomes. And maybe it will raise them in 10 years, maybe, but that's a maybe. And we don't have the answer, but we do have the answer for strategies when taught well. Now, another thank you to Natalie Wexler, because she has pointed out that strategies can be taught poorly. And that we totally agree with, and that needs to be extinguished. And we need to start teaching them in a self-regulated way and the ones that have been validated.
So you say self-regulated. I think that needs to be clarified. Are you talking about metacognition, thinking about your thinking? Are you talking about being able to question as you read? Just for the viewers, I think that's a term of art. How about that? That might not be clear to the average listener.
You're revealing all of your depth and expertise in this area when you use all of those phrases. And I hope that our listeners are familiar. And if they're not, if you can put some links so that they can learn more about everything you're saying. As an entry point, the most basic level to get started with self-regulation, I think, is using self-talk to guide yourself. That is like the curb cut in, and start with just positivity. I can do this. I can read this book. My kids would say complex text, you're going down, because they would go in with confidence. And then you metacognitively, but I don't, that's a high level term. On a very concrete level, I am then going to write BWA on my paper before I read, while I read, after I read. And those are going to remind me that before I read, I should activate what I already know. I should try to put together a gist statement based on the title and a quick skim. While I read, I should box and underline. Don't just teach kids how to box and underline, because they won't pick it up and use it independently. But if you teach them to write BWA and to cue themselves, and then follow those steps and check them off as they do each, then I see them on those state assessments, pull out their pen, write BWA, and start marking up that text, because they're in charge and they're guiding themselves.
Judy, are there any people in the city right now doing any of these strategies? Because Leslie has been doing work in New York City. She brought some of these self-regulation type strategies into the city, but the city is a big place. So I'm wondering if you've seen any of this in action.
I definitely see a big shift in New York City. So universal literacy was a great focus on K-2. However, right now the attention has been made to go from K-12. So there's coaching in the higher levels, lower levels, and there's definitely more attention on comprehension, 100%. However, I think there's a learning curve for a lot of people. I think we've been teaching comprehension in many schools with a strategy approach, but we're not quite sure, was that the right approach or not the right approach? I definitely see an increase in shared reading through a different lens, through a closed reading lens. So there's definitely shifts, but I don't know if it's exactly the same everywhere. I just don't know yet. Things are just shifting. I feel a rapid shift. I feel a really rapid shift. I see principals that are just excited for all the new research coming out. But I think there's definitely a learning curve. And I think that a lot of schools are now looking more intensely at what's the curriculum. You know, before I was, as I've said on many episodes, there's been the DIY, the do-it-yourself model. I don't see as many do-it-yourself models. I see a lot less of TC in schools. I see schools really looking at what's next. You know, I see HMH in some schools, some core knowledge, not that much. Some schools are EL. I think that it's a transition
But
time,
it's all over the place. It's what you're saying is it's all over the place.
But
And
I definitely, yeah, but you know, it's interesting because, you know, we're still confused, right? Now they're saying strategies are okay. I know Sarah Vallow came out with a new book on strategies. So just that word can look very different, right? So
Yes.
we all now know that we want to follow an evidence-structured based approach. You know, but then here's Nate's bombshell. Faith, I called you right before the episode. You know, I wasn't feeling good today. I was at work. I was tired, but I had to pick up the phone and I said, oh my God, Nate just revealed the bombshell. And I don't love looking at this kind of data. I'd rather look at Acadian's data and so forth. But here's his bombshell. Both meta-analysis showed no significant effect for vocabulary or background knowledge instruction on standardized tests. And I'm like, wait a minute, we're paying attention to all the 5 pillars, but we're not seeing the results. Once again, what is the solution? So Leslie has been kind enough to, you know, speak about some of those things, but I don't know if all those methods are very familiar to everybody. I'm sure a lot of people, I mean, she mentioned the Benson School, great. And I think that's my former district where I was a teacher back in the day in Brooklyn. However, I don't think that everybody is on the same page as to what the solution is. I think we all have it in our heart.
we're not on the same page. That's clear. That is clear. But I think that's why we had invited Leslie on, because
Right.
I think that, you know, we're getting a view that we should do a lot of content knowledge building. And I agree with that. And Leslie agreed with that. We all agree how important it is,
100%.
but we can't just say, you know, strategies are not good. We have
Right.
so much evidence, and the evidence has been around for years.
So then why are we still
this is not a
confused?
new thing. It's not new.
But Faith, why are we still struggling with it? I mean, I was trained in reading recovery in 2013 because they said this is the way to do it.
Okay,
How the
because
hell do
some
we figure out the
voices
right
get
way?
heard more than others. That's why we're having Leslie on now, because maybe, you know, it's the way social media works. Certain voices get heard louder and clearer, and then everybody jumps on the bandwagon. And so I think it's really important to look at the research, look at what's happening here, hear from people who are in the field. That's the other issue. We need to hear from people in the field who actually do the work. And, you know, I'm going to bring this also back to Leslie now. Nate said that he looked at 501 studies on the topic, 3 meta-analyses, no compelling evidence for, you know, content knowledge instruction. And what you're saying is in line with what Nate said. Basically, Leslie, that what he said in his article, I think somewhat goes along with what you're saying too, but I don't think we hear a lot of that. What are your thoughts, Leslie?
I think that there's been this well-funded, publisher-driven movement to get knowledge-based curriculum into the hands of schools. There's, you know, there's all kinds of agendas for that. And they've gotten it in, and the schools are not seeing any gains. I've been tracking this since 2017-18 when it first exploded. I won't mention the districts, but large districts were at the forefront keynoting, we got to build knowledge. And then I kept watching their scores, and they were literally going down, down, down. And I think that the ball is beginning to drop. That, like, I mean, I know of one district that is highly held up as a model, and their ELA scores went down. I'm not going to say the number.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going down, down, down.
But could it
Then they're
also
focusing.
could it be what Natalie Wexler is saying, that some of these shifts take time? I just want to go back to her
I
article.
agree, but
And-
why not do
and-
both?
Right, I
Not do
agree with
both.
that. We need
Because
to
then
do
we could
both.
see the gains and we could be building knowledge.
I
But
agree
people
with
are
that.
trashing, and I will tell you from my experience working under a very large federal grant to scale evidence-based practices. We worked with almost 50 schools this year. And I'll tell you what I saw day after day, meeting with superintendents and principals nearly every day from probably 200 or 300 schools. I will tell you what I was being told that was really alarming. But back to a minute ago, the ELA scores are plummeting in the schools that I know of. I sat through a webinar through a large organization, and they were featuring a school that had adopted a knowledge curriculum. And I quickly Googled them and saw their scores going down. Like, we need to, before we promote we need to see that the response from this team is now change the test.
Right.
That was not being said 3-4 years ago. 4 years ago, it was, oh, woo ha ha, let's get these knowledge-based kids will grow so much. When they didn't, they suddenly said, change the test. If I don't like what my scale says, I can buy a new scale that will tell me that I weigh less. But I need to actually face the fact that I thought something would work. So what's happening in the schools? This is the sad part, but I'm hopeful the pendulum will swing. You're holding this webinar. I was told in school after school, we were going to give them free, actually, they were going to get stipends, get paid to do this, to adopt evidence-based practices for literacy that are highly, highly validated. We had schools that had 40% gains, and we had those superintendents on meeting with these people. School after school said, we're adopting a knowledge curriculum. It will be too heavy a lift. And I was like, horse and cart. How are you going to deliver that cart without a horse? You're going to saddle your teachers with all of this knowledge where they have to dig through tomes and tomes of books to learn all of this. And you're not giving them a horse to actually deliver it to the kids and help the kids take off and use it independently. That was literally the real world this year. It was either knowledge or strategies, and everybody was going with knowledge.
Do the tests test for comprehension skills? Natalie mentioned that in her article. Would you agree that a reading test actually tries to avoid knowledge, and they want to see if kids are using reading skills?
I don't think so, because the tests are reflective of zip code. And
That's it.
Kids in different zip codes are not applying skills. They simply have a stronger language base. But we have defied zip code. Again, if you Google school digger, Cumberland, Rhode Island, you will see they went from 40 to 80. None of the children changed. The teachers didn't change. They simply started using strategies, and we flipped zip code on its head. So no, I don't agree with Natalie Wexler that they are testing skills. I think they are reflective of the language. And what we did in the Cumberland schools was we lifted language. We were not giving them any hokey skills. That's not what they were using on the tests. We had lifted language, and we had helped them become more self-regulated learners.
Okay. And, it's interesting because there are people on Twitter, social media, and they are basically saying, many of them, I'm not going to mention names, that this is the way to go. And they point to states like Tennessee. They point to
Tennessee rolled out SRSD statewide.
That's what I wanted to ask you about.
I worked with them. We brought it to 40,000 classrooms. We did. I worked with the state leaders and 200 coaches, and we brought SRSD to every classroom in Tennessee. They're not using knowledge curriculum across most of that state.
That's not what you would believe if you follow Twitter.
Wow.
You follow Twitter, it seems like the way Tennessee boosted their scores is by obviously bringing phonics in. That was
That they did, because I
That
was
they
there. I
did.
was
Yes.
involved in the whole
Yes,
movement from
yes.
2012, where they were Score Tennessee or something, and they got the largest federal grant, and they brought me down to roll out self-regulated strategy development to 40,000 classrooms, and we did. And while I was there, the room next to me was like, who's the letters leader?
Moats?
Thank you. I think she was involved. There were a lot of phonics gurus, and you could not even say certain names from the literature that were not phonics people. Like, they were very clear. I was so proud of them that they were very clear that we all need phonics in every classroom, but they also needed evidence-based practices.
Mhm.
And they were bringing in all of evidence-based. I didn't see knowledge curriculum anywhere.
Okay, well, I could tell you definitely,
People are
without a
going to
doubt,
attribute the success to something else.
correct. That is exactly. And I could tell you that they make it sound like by bringing in content knowledge curriculum, that's why Tennessee is going way up, and other states as well.
They're
And-
speaking out of two sides of their mouth. They're saying, well, change the test because this won't impact the test. But then they're saying tests went up. It must have been knowledge.
That's interesting. I even heard, I don't know where I heard this. I heard a rumor that short responses are going to be the way to go without the extended response. Is that true, or was I like dreaming in my sleep having a nightmare?
More and more tests are doing that. I like the idea of using writing to capture learning.
Of course. But if you get rid of it, it's like a Band-Aid, right? You're putting on a Band-Aid again. I think another thing that we haven't really mentioned is, so a lot of the parents in the suburbs, I know their kids opt out of the test.
Mhm.
I don't know if we see that as much in city schools. I don't think, some of the parents might not know, some of the parents might not care, some parents might think it's mandated. Do you think that also plays a role in what the data is telling us and so forth?
I know it's big in New York. I've seen huge number of opt-outs, but
In
I'm
New
in
York?
Massachusetts.
Really?
I see almost none in my state. So no.
I see a lot in
And again-
Connecticut, in Westchester, there's a lot of opt-out. But it's hard because, so.
Definitely
mentioned
not,
something
because they reflect zip code.
Right.
And the fact that they're reflecting zip code shows that they really are. And we can change zip code by implementing very rigorous strategies.
That's really, that's good,
without
because that's important to hear, because, unfortunately, a lot of the kids that I work with during the day, there's a lot of kids that live in shelters, transitional housing, and so forth. Maybe some of those students have never been to a beach. Maybe they've never, maybe they have, maybe they haven't. Maybe they've been to a museum. Maybe they haven't. How do we level off the playing field? And
well, that's what Natalie Wexler actually is saying, that, I'm just going to pivot for a second. That's exactly what she's saying. Because kids have not had those experiences, they're at a disadvantage. And that's why a content knowledge curriculum is so important, because it's supposed to build schema at the youngest ages.
That word I've heard so much.
If I may just say,
schema. I've heard that one 1,000,001 times.
One thing they just said is they are supposed to.
Okay.
And that is where there are two sides to Natalie Wexler. She has illuminated something important, but then she needs to recognize where she doesn't have the expertise, and that is in the empirical. When she says supposed to, and she has her theory change the test, and a theory knowledge should build ELA. Well, the theory didn't turn out to be right so far from what we can see. The empirical research and the schools have not supported it. Let's do it because we believe in it. And maybe there's a 10-year gain. So let's keep doing it, because why not put our eggs in all baskets and make sure we've covered all bases. But the theories of change the test, maybe 10 years from now that will happen. But for right now, if we want our children to succeed in the real world on the tests that are in front of them, then we need to be using strategies that are best promise. And I think we come to a nice place of both. And Natalie Wexler's thrown out a beautiful theory. Why not address it? Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. We don't know. But we do know that strategies work. So those should be a definite.
Right.
but what
Right.
strategies are we using is key. And I think
So,
you mentioned some, but
Yeah.
you know,
So
that word's
can I
being
just
thrown
tell
around.
you, let me jump in a
Yeah,
second.
yeah, yeah.
Nate actually listed some of them in this
Yeah.
article. He
Nice.
said in the early grades,
Yes.
vocabulary
Yeah.
instruction
Yes.
Yeah.
showed the most benefits, and in
Yeah.
the later grades, strategy instruction.
Can I
Yes, I
say
saw that
something about
too.
that?
Yes, go ahead.
So that resonates so deeply because
Right.
I was just, as I shared with you, I was working under a federal grant and we were rolling out evidence-based practices K through 5. K2, we were really focused on the vocabulary and knowledge building, but underlying language building. But vocabulary is what we kept pushing K2. 3 to 5 is where we were really pushing the strategies. And I had not broken it down and thought of it that way, but that's what we were following, the evidence base, and that's what we were seeing. So that resonates with me so deeply that K to 2, you can model collaborative reading, collaborative writing, you can build a word box and fill that in with your kids and have them turn and talk and use the words. By the time they hit 2nd, 3rd grade, you then hand them the strategies and tell them, now go build an organizer, build a language box, populate it with the words from the book you're reading. They can take off with the strategies at that slightly older age. Younger age, fill them with vocab.
Yep, I love that. And then he also said for struggling readers, reciprocal teaching,
Mhm.
graphic organizers, and vocabulary instruction for the struggling reader.
Right.
All right, because if you could read, then you're getting your vocabulary because you're a reader.
Yes.
But for the struggling reader, you need to be a little bit more direct in the instruction for
That's right.
vocabulary. So what he's saying in his research certainly aligns with what the three of us are seeing, I think. But I do think what Natalie Wexler's work does, as you said, it illuminates the idea that we should be paying attention to building knowledge. But I think we agree, at least, that just having a curriculum that's content knowledge instruction is not going to do it for a lot of kids.
The strategies are what deliver. I think I'm quoting Susan Smart. The strategies are what deliver the content to the children. What are we going to do? Push knowledge down their throats? We need a strategy to deliver it. And knowledge is growing exponentially. We have no hope that we can actually teach a drop of knowledge that will impact the amount of knowledge knowledge is doubling every day.
That's right.
Children need to know how to learn. Sure, we can give them a drop of knowledge and we're all going to argue over what that knowledge should be. Should it be
That's
division?
right.
Should it be the Civil War and what really happened?
Right. How do you determine
what knowledge?
Right.
But if we teach them how to learn and give them those drops of knowledge, and that will have to be figured out with the states and districts, but the knowledge we can give them is 1/1000th of the knowledge that they're going to need. And people say, oh, my husband studied stats and then he read an article on stats and he understood it better. Yeah, well, are we going to fill children with every bit of knowledge and then they'll go out in the world and they need to learn?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's very interesting. You make a very good point, Leslie. How do we determine? We're never going to be able to cover every topic.
We'll never agree.
I definitely think that kids definitely need an explicit model on how to do things. That's part of the science of reading.
And they need
you
knowledge.
don't know how to just do it through the power of osmosis. There's a model. There's a think aloud. This is how I'm problem solving. This is what I'm doing. This is how I'm doing it. This is why I'm doing it. This is how it can help you. And things only become automatic if we let kids have that repetitive practice. It's almost like
repetitive practice. That's what we taught in our study this
Right.
year. We call them power
Right.
cycles.
Right.
And it's where you model and then you
Of
model
course.
with a little release, then you model
Right,
more,
exactly.
and then the kids do it. But you're going through a cycle where you're using
Of
the reading
course.
strategies and the writing, and then you're scoring and reflecting. Takes about 2 weeks. Then they do it again with a little less teacher guidance. And
That's
we
right.
have these 2-week strategy application and reflection cycles. And we saw that the more that the teachers were fitting in, like robbing Peter to pay Paul to find the time. I absolutely hear you, Judy, on the time. But the more power cycles the kids were going through, the faster they were becoming independent with then applying the strategies on their own and becoming
Everything is
self-directed.
practice.
It's like a
Everything is
gradual
practice and repetition.
Yeah, it's
That's
like a
what learning
gradual
is.
release process, right?
Taking them
It's
through it
gradual
over and over.
release.
But it's
So-
so fun if you stick with it and do it, because
Right.
then, but the problem is the publishers aren't making any money off of this. So, they're not promoting the idea that strategies are really what it's all about. We do need good, high quality instructional materials. Oh my goodness, we absolutely need them. But again, they are the cart. The horse is the instruction and the strategy.
That's 100% right. It's just like riding a bike. You're not gonna, my father taught me how to ride a bike. He held the back of the bike for a couple of weeks. And then all of a sudden, I remember when I was 7 years old, and then finally after repeated practice, he
Being
let
able
go.
to do
And there
it.
I was.
I remember the day I showed my dad how I could ride my bike.
Right. Or swimming. You're not going to throw a baby in the pool and say, just go swim. You're going to show the baby how to swim. You're not signing the baby up or the 3-year-old or the 5-year-old up for one lesson. You need at least 6
And
or
you're not
7
going to take a
lessons.
bucket and pour it down the child's mouth and say, take all this knowledge. You're going to give them a cup and a way to take some water and then digest it, because the kids need to learn how to find their own knowledge and take it in so that they can become self-propelling.
Right.
In
That's right.
finding, and every time they don't know something enough about a topic, they know how to learn about that topic.
So at the end of Natalie Wexler's article, she finishes it off by saying, and for those educators who have made the switch to a knowledge building curriculum, the more study, this was the study she referenced in the article that talked about, transferring, the transfer from content building at the beginning to long-term gains that you see over time. The more study should provide reassurance that they're on the right track, even if they're not yet seeing results on standardized reading tests.
No, I could not disagree more strongly. And I don't know how responsible it is to write and publish something like that, because now schools are going to adopt this knowledge building with rejecting the strategies, and the strategies are what are going to move the children. I worked in the Worcester public schools. We began K-6, then the middle school picked up the strategies, then the high school. Last year, they graduated more children who had been through 12 years of SRSD, who went first generation, were accepted to the Ivy Leagues, Yale, Dartmouth, but they had 12 years of strategy instruction. There was never a knowledge building curriculum in there. We have no evidence to make a statement like that. You can be reassured even if we're not seeing gains. Okay, let's give you that. Maybe we're not seeing gains, but where is your evidence that we will see gains in another area?
Mm-hmm. And we have evidence for right now.
And we have evidence
on strategy instruction.
First generation getting into the Ivy Leagues after 12 years of strategies.
I was a little surprised to see that that's how the article ended, because like I said, there's a lot I agree with with what she says.
I agree.
But that statement, I was a little surprised about, because to just basically say, it's almost like saying, well, trust us, it's going to show up.
Snake oil. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be using that, but it is sort of like balanced literacy. Oh, don't worry, it'll work.
It'll work. That was my
might not see
and I
gains,
know
you
she
might
will
not be
not
reading in
want it
third
to
grade.
be perceived that way. I know it. But when I read that statement was like, teachers for a long time now have been told things.
To take things on faith. No, ask to see a model school, ask to see a research study.
That's right.
And if I may just throw in something like totally opposite to everything we're saying, like, where are the model schools?
They're out there, but I want to go there. Can somebody take me on a trip to the best schools on planet?
I know, because
road trip.
like I'm
Road
phonics
trip.
to the for, but I want to see a school that has taken on phonics and then seen gains, and then I can go visit that school. And there's something in phonics that where it hasn't met its promise yet. It will.
It
But
will, it will.
I think we need to partner it with an equal emphasis on listening comprehension and strategies. And then I think we'll see more of the promise. I do see that in my schools. When I come in and I bring SRSD and I'm going into an Orton Gillingham school, it takes faster and the gains are higher and stronger. But so far, we're in the science of reading world, pulling up research studies, but where are our schools?
Well, I do think the place to start is phonics. I do. I think
do
that
too.
is the foundation.
Without a doubt. Without a
And
doubt.
so
But we
I don't
still
want
need
to
to
leave people thinking that, that's not so
You
important.
can't
to
leave
me.
people
think it's
thinking
not
that,
enough.
Faith.
That's,
Faith, you can't. You can't because
You can't. You
if
got to
say,
the gateway
if you
is
say it's
phonics.
not phonics and you say it's something like everybody's watching, everybody's thinking about literacy, everybody wants to do the
And
right
I'm
thing.
not saying it's not phonics, but I am raising an important question. It's phonics and what?
And
Because
how?
where are our schools? Our schools, a
And
lot
how?
of schools have switched over and are doing phonics, and we're not seeing the gains yet. So what is that missing piece that we need in addition to the phonics?
and I do think that we need to have those core strategies that we know work, in addition to having way more social studies and science built into the school day. So I'm in agreement with you. One last point before we start kind of wrapping up. It says here in the article, in Natalie's article, that Daniel Willingham said that the tests are basically knowledge tests in disguise. What is your thought about that?
I think Daniel Willingham has raised an important puzzle. And it's not one that I've figured out yet. He's raised a question, but I don't think building knowledge shows any promise of being the answer. It is a very interesting question, but back to feet on the ground in schools every day. What is working? What research do we have that really will move these schools? I don't think he has a viable solution. By saying that teaching 10 lessons on strategies is enough, fine, but then the kids need to be coached through practicing them over and over and over and over. And he doesn't acknowledge that. He says, teach 10 and then what, move on? Like, you need to teach 10, but then you need to practice them all year long in a guided release model. So he's raising this question about, is it just a knowledge test in disguise? I don't think so, because I know in the Cumberland schools and in the research that I've looked at, that we can move the needle. Wanzek moved the needle. She had a 0.38 effect size, 4 times.
That's pretty big, yes.
And she wasn't teaching knowledge.
Yeah.
So I don't think it is a knowledge test in disguise, but he does raise interesting questions.
Well, I do think, and I think both of you would agree, kids who are born into homes where it's, they're from college educated parents, where there's a lot of, talk, a lot of vocabulary, a lot of experiences, they do better on these tests. Can't deny that having, growing up in a home where that's nurtured will benefit those kids.
Oh, will benefit, but we can still move the needle. I was in Pawtucket. They had 22% proficient. We got them up to 47. We didn't do anything to the home life. We just taught more strategies. I think strategies are under acknowledged in terms of how much they can move that, because we can't change the home life very much. We can have a home program. I don't know how successful they've been, but we can change how we teach.
It also comes down, though, that a lot of those kids that have those experiences where they're going to museums and so forth, a lot of those parents also have money to tutor their kids after school. Maybe that's having an effect. I don't know.
Yeah, that too.
I think there's an effect with the tutoring more for phonics than it is in that area, because knowledge is incremental. It builds slowly over time. I don't know how you can really get that through tutoring sessions.
Well, the quicker you learn how to lift the words off the page, the quicker you can
So
start.
that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm
Right.
saying. In that particular area, I think there's probably more work that tutoring could do. But the idea of knowledge building and vocabulary building, I think that's home life. That is more about those kids growing up saturated in that kind of environment. But what we're saying is, what can the schools do?
Right.
Forget the home life, we're teachers.
Those kids are there for 7 hours a
exactly
day,
can
right?
we do?
And both, where I'm sure we all began this conversation, that,
Right.
where we wind up is it's and both. The strategies will have a powerful and monumental and quick impact. And then after that, we continue layering in the knowledge and continued nuanced use of the strategies. And I do believe we can hit 95. Cumberland's already at 80.
Mhm.
And I think they're going to go higher and higher. And they started at 40.
Wow.
I do think we can get close to that. And maybe knowledge is like icing on the cake, like a piece that will continue to move it at a smaller rate, but it can give us those extra percents each year.
All right, so let's wrap up, ladies. So any last thoughts that we did not cover that you would like to add? Anybody?
I'll give a last thought. So first, I want to thank Nate the Great. He doesn't care what team you're on. He doesn't care if you're balanced literacy or if you're structured literacy. He's going to tell you the truth. He's looking at those mathematical data pieces. And I really appreciate that, because me, as a person that's in the field coaching, teaching, I don't want to do that work. I like to look at Acadians data and so forth. So thank you to Nate. I also want to thank Leslie tremendously for telling me that there is hope, that, you know, even the kids that are having a hard time and don't have a great home life and so forth, that there's hope. Because, you know, there's so much happening in education right now that I think that all the people that are watching this, we all want to learn. But, you know, just thinking about strategies, that might not look the same, right? The ones that are effective are the ones that we need to start prioritizing. So I can't wait as an educator to prioritize that and for everybody to kind of be on the same page, because it can't be that down the block here, so I'm doing this is going on here. There has to be a way to do better. There has to be, but thank you for giving us hope.
And I also want to chime in and say thank you, Dr. Leslie Laud, for being with us. And I hope that people will check out your website on Think SRSD. Is it .org?
.com.
.com. And we'll put that in the show notes, because I do think that you know, people need to learn a little bit more about what's going on in strategy instruction, especially since the research really supports having those strategies in the classroom. And I'm so glad we had this conversation. And I do want to thank Natalie Wexler for the work that she does as well. And that I think that, you know, journalists do bring an important piece to this discussion. And it illuminates what we need to look at. But I do think the people in the field need to be heard more. And I'm glad we were able to bring you on. So thank you so much. And thank you for everyone for listening. And please follow us. It's the Literacy View. We have a Facebook page. We are, what else?
Here, I have
You're always the one who does this.
All right, so I wrote it down. Follow us on Facebook, the Literacy View, Real Teachers Letting Loose. Follow us on YouTube, the Literacy View. We're also on all the podcasts, the Literacy View. Also follow my beautiful Faith on Twitter at Faith Burkowski. Follow me at Boxner Judy, and follow Leslie, Natalie, Nate. These discussions are the best thing ever. We are called The View for a reason. We don't all have to agree, but these conversations are what's going to push the work forward.
Yes, that is it. All right. So long, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. Truly transformational. You've changed my mind and made me think about things I hadn't thought about, and you're making me see things differently. And it's always a joy to learn and grow. So thank you.
Thank you. Then we're doing our job. Thank you.
Have a great evening.
You too.
Bye-bye.